The 2000 NBA draft class is often viewed as the worst draft class of all time, with draft busts up the wahoo, disappointments all throughout the lottery, and a roster full of guys that leaves you wanting more. But when it comes to basketball, things are never as simple as they seem. With draft steals that change the game and players that you may have forgotten about, today we're going to answer if this is really the worst draft class of all time. And how else would we start but the first overall pick, Kenyon Martin. Now, Kmart is known for playing his heart out defensively and getting really mad on the Gilbert Arenas podcast. Now, I don't know why he's so mad all the time, he should probably chill out, but defense is really his legacy. Now, I like Kenyon Martin, but this is really where this draft gets started out on the wrong foot. Kenyon Martin was not super highly sought after. He was a college senior drafted with the first overall pick with expectations that were just not that high. I mean, with college averages of 19 and 10 with 3 blocks, don't get me wrong, this was the best prospect at the time and the best player in the NCAA, but in terms of upside for a first overall pick, I don't know if Kenyon Martin really had what you'd expect for somebody in this position. This guy was like a lob threat offensively, with a low scoring ceiling and adequate touch around the basket. His defensive expectations were somewhat high, but not like top of the line can't miss defender, and really that's where he fell. He was decent. He was top 10 in DPOY voting just once, and he usually was outside of the top 20. He brought energy defensively, but this guy wasn't a sound defender, getting into the right spots, making the right reads, and orchestrating defenses. He might be the best defender to never crack an all-defense first team, but he also was not elite enough to ever crack one. He averaged over 10 rebounds only once and averaged about a block per game for his career. He was athletic and physically imposing, but didn't always put it to great use. Really, Kenyon Martin was a rather uninteresting talent that painted the picture for the remainder of the draft. He was a one-time All-Star when he peaked offensively at under 17 a game with under 10 rebounds. Really, with top picks, whether or not they deserve it, at the start of their career, they could see a higher usage when really having the skill set and talent of a role player, and that's what Martin did to start his career, scoring inefficiently with the Nets. After moving to the Nuggets and finding the role that his skill set belonged in, there was a decline and stabilization as a 12 and 8 a night guy. Not bad, but I mean, just okay. And weirdly enough, not even surprising for the first overall pick. He didn't surpass any expectations, and he wasn't overly exciting to watch out there. I mean, as a one-time All-Star and one of the lowest expectations of a first overall pick, Kenyon Martin was fine. But in terms of starting off the draft, this really wasn't too hot of a start. Now, I did not call Kenyon Martin a bust. I don't think most people would, maybe a couple out there. It's a relatively meaningless word because it means something different to each person you ask. But in the case of Stromile Swift, it doesn't even matter. This guy is a bust in every way, shape, or form of the word. Now, I'm actually probably Stromile Swift's biggest fan because he has a super sick name and threw down one of the hardest dunks that the NBA's ever seen.
CBS, you are headed to Little Rock, Arkansas. Swift hammers it! A tomahawk from Stromile Swift! And I do want to point out, Little Rock is just delightful at this time of the year.
Now, that was pretty sick, but other than his dunk reel, Stromile Swift totally sucked ass. He was athletic, but peaked around 12 and 6 because this guy had the basketball IQ of a potato. He was super foul prone, would get lost on offense and defense, and had no idea how to put his ridiculous athleticism to good use. Swift would only score double digits in the NBA in 2 seasons and do so inefficiently, while only really shooting at the rim, and being what should be a rather elite defensive presence, but didn't even come close to his ceiling. Really, he kinda hit his floor. After being given the nickname the Stro Show in the dunk contest, Swift kind of became a meme before memes were a thing. This guy was drafted onto the Vancouver Grizzlies, who sucked ass their whole existence, and was given so many more chances than he would have otherwise received. But time after time, this guy was just hunting his next poster dunk or block into the stands, while being such a low IQ and rather low skill player that he was really just completely ineffective on the floor. In terms of helping their cause, a number 2 pick like Swift definitely is an ugly choice that no one would deny. But Darius Miles is much more puzzling. Now, the third overall pick in this draft, and Darius Miles to the Clippers is a bit of a fan favorite. He's a bit more relevant than his play would warrant. I mean, he got some big acting roles, his knucklehead celebration was iconic, and of course, his podcast would keep him in the limelight to this day. But was Darius really that special of a talent? In reality, Darius never at all put it together. He was ruined by injury before that, unfortunately, which was the killer of his career at just 24 years old. But as an inefficient 14-point scorer at his absolute best, Miles was an exciting guy to watch due to his athleticism, but never ever was too much of an effective NBA player. I mean, this guy's kind of just a what if. He was a good defensive talent that had his athleticism taken away from him and never really had the opportunity to improve because of that. To add insult to injury, Miles built a resume as a Portland jailblazer. While playing what would be his best ball, he was also screaming racial slurs at his coach, would later be arrested for carrying a loaded gun at the fucking airport, and would declare bankruptcy 6 years after making $60 million in the NBA. Darius Miles wasn't a bad player necessarily, but in terms of his output given his draft position, the selection of Darius Miles 3rd overall was at the bare minimum very underwhelming. Now, if you're noticing a trend here, Marcus Fizer doesn't break it. In fact, he only makes it worse. Because drafted 4th overall to the Bulls, Marcus Fizer absolutely sucked ass playing for 5 seasons and then dipped. Now, I don't want to roast Fizer too hard because literally nobody talks about him, but this dude is remembered as one of the worst Chicago Bulls in history. As a junior out of Iowa State that was compared to Charles Barkley, this dude was an all-around bruiser power forward that lacked in areas that made Barkley great. He wasn't quick on his feet, which hurt him offensively, but more so defensively, he was terrible. He wasn't a great scorer inside, in terms of touch around the basket, or just getting shots off with some clunky footwork. And just at that was a big guy who couldn't block a shot or shoot above 40% in the NBA while being pretty undersized for his position. I mean, Fizer totally sucked ass, but to give him a little bit of a break, it did appear that due to sharing the floor with Elton Brand, he would be played out of position in Chicago, and minor injuries before a big ACL tear really ramped up the speed of his NBA exits. But nonetheless, 4 picks in, and things are not looking so pretty. Now, Mike Miller is debatably the best player we've covered so far. He was Rookie of the Year out of this class, he won a 6th Man of the Year award, and he peaked at over 18 points per game. Mike Miller is mostly remembered as a 3-point specialist, and although that was a great moment that helped solidify his legacy, his younger years were more so where we really saw Mike Miller in action. Truly, this guy was not a 3-point specialist, just a damn good shooter, because before the injuries, he could do a bit of everything offensively. He was a big wing who might have been the 2nd best ball handler on the floor, while being able to score super efficiently. Like I said, his best production was putting up an empty 18 on a Pau Gasol-less Grizzlies squad, but what really was a better indication of his talents was his efficient 14 a night the year before, with a 6th Man of the Year award on a really solid Grizzlies squad. Really, that's closer to the kind of player he was, as his older years were kind of Kyle Korver-esque, while in his prime, Mike Miller was closer to a Diet Tyler Hero standing at 6'8" before injuries sadly slowed him down. Was Mike Miller a legend? No, not really. He really wasn't even an all-star, but his game is really fun to watch, and it was really effective while aging well into a long 17-year career, even though injuries kind of had their way with him earlier on. I mean, Mike Miller isn't a bad 5th overall pick, everybody likes this guy, but really, is he making up for some of the picks before and after him? Well, let's keep going to find out. Now, Mike Miller was pretty tough, but DerMarr Johnson is a straight-up devastation. As a 6'9" 2-guard, this guy may have had the highest ceiling in the whole damn draft class. This guy was a big-ass guard who could play 1 through 3, could handle the ball really well, shoot the ball extremely well, and was athletic for his size. Johnson had denied entering the league earlier for the purpose of waiting until his game was NBA ready, because his goal wasn't to make it to the NBA, it was to stay and succeed in the NBA. After 2 seasons with the Hawks, DerMarr wasn't exactly adjusting super well to the speed and physicality of the NBA game, scoring 5, then 8.4 points on 37 and 39% shooting from the field. Johnson was improving, but was far from an immediate success. His frame was thin, and he was really more of just a big shooter with the potential to grow into more, at a time where 3-point shooting wings weren't exactly the golden gooses of the NBA like they might be now. Sadly, after this time, injury would derail Johnson's career, but probably not in the way that you'd expect. Johnson was involved in a total freak accident on September 13th, 2002. Johnson's car crashed into a tree and bursted into flames. It was unclear who was driving at the time, as Johnson was one of the 3 occupants. He suffered 4 fractured vertebrae in his neck, coming dangerously close to paralysis. During his recovery, he wore a halo brace and missed the entire 2002-2003 season, sparking doubts about whether he would ever play again. A fraction of an inch, one way or the other, and it would have been very bad. Johnson was at serious risk of paralysis or worse. This was damn near career-ending at minimum, and really, he's lucky it wasn't. Johnson would luckily continue his career for another 5 years, with his best year coming with the Knicks scoring 7 a game on good shooting splits. Really not bad numbers, but after a couple of other injuries, this time taking place on the floor, Johnson's career would sadly be too inconsistent to land a long-term spot in the NBA. I mean, obviously we can't call Johnson a bust. This dude almost died, then came back to play NBA basketball a year later. That's pretty insane. But for the sake of our cause here, DerMarr Johnson certainly didn't meet expectations for his draft position, and due to him still working out the kinks of his game prior to the crash, Johnson is not really talked about much at all. Now, at this point, as long as you don't shave points or something, I probably won't call you a bust in this ass cheeks class, but in 99% of classes, Chris Mihm at 7th overall would be a pretty big fumble. I mean, we're gonna move pretty fast on this guy because there isn't really shit to talk about, but peaking as a 10-point scorer that was very forgettable, playing his best basketball on a Lakers squad that was absolutely carried by Kobe Bryant going apeshit surrounded by bums. I mean, just look at Chris Mihm. From his face to his name, this guy just looks like a backup center. He could score inside pretty well and come off the bench and make hook shots while playing pretty shitty defense around the basket. Mihm's career was derailed after an injury sprain at age 26, and he disappeared from the league without anyone really noticing. Now, I'm not gonna lie, we're 7 picks deep into this draft. We've been doing this for like 12 minutes now, and the highlights of the first 7 are Mike Miller and Kenyon Martin. Really, for the draft positions, they might be below average. Martin definitely, Miller maybe. I don't want to think too deeply about it because it'll give me depression. But at number 8, we got a guy who finally makes this thing more interesting, and that's Jamal Crawford. I mean, there isn't too much to tell you that you don't already know. So let's just review his career a bit while you watch his highlights for a couple minutes. At 6'5" with really long arms, Jamal Crawford was probably the shiftiest player in basketball history, at least for his size. I mean, it was crazy how good this dude was with the rock in his hand. By his 4th season in Chicago, he was putting up 17 a game. By 2008, he was dropping 20 as a part of the New York Knicks squad. But after landing in Atlanta in 2010, Crawford found his role where you probably remember him the best. Playing a part of multiple 50-plus win squads, all into his 30s, Jamal Crawford became a 3-time 6th Man of the Year winner with the Hawks and Lob City Clippers. I mean, this guy's probably the best 6th man of all time, just given how long he was balling at this position. He was a scorer, he wasn't necessarily efficient, but it didn't matter who was on the floor alongside him. This guy was going to get buckets no matter what. The ball was on a string. He could shoot the ball from anywhere and score inside incredibly well. This guy was a total Energizer bunny that came in and got buckets in the most unique way possible and came out for a 20-year career. I mean, dropping from 14 to 18 points per game off the bench in his mid-30s, Jamal Crawford was one of the funnest players of all time, and in terms of 6th men, has a resume as good as anybody. Now, J Crossover's sick, but is he enough to save the misery of the lottery? Well, in reality, not even close, because the rest of it is an absolute train wreck. Joel Przybilla was drafted 9th overall to the Rockets before being moved to Milwaukee. I mean, I guess this guy was alright. At his best, he was top 15 in DPOY voting. He was a big body center who would get in the way of people darting at the rim, and really just etched out a 13-year career by knowing how to utilize his size defensively. Offensively, this guy was efficient, I guess, but never scored over 7 a game, so I mean, does it really matter how efficient you are? In terms of value, this guy is just a vanilla-ass player. He kind of seems like a placeholder in the league. I mean, even his nickname on Basketball Reference calls him the Vanilla Gorilla. But a pretty decent defender nonetheless, but nothing that pops out, especially for a top 10 pick. Now, closing out the top 10, we got Keyon Dooling. In terms of his play, I mean, there's more to be desired. He was compared to a big Steve Francis coming into the league, which is certainly some high praise, but due to a lack of polish on his offensive game, he was never an efficient scorer and was mostly just a defender and a tempo-pushing transition-heavy guard who came off the bench for 13 seasons. I mean, Dooling was kind of a fun player. He could throw down sweet dunks, would play decent to good defense, and wouldn't do anything too stupid with the ball. Not exactly blowing anything out of the water, coming out of the top 10, but Dooling also had one of the crazier stories prior to the NBA that he's come about recently, so I'm not going to cook him too bad. There's plenty of worse players to come in this draft, and Jerome Moiso is certainly one of them. Now, Jerome was compared to KG coming out of college. Super agility and offensive touch, borderline freak, very quick hands, is adept at putbacks, and has great touch out to 18 feet. Great leaping ability, potential is very high, can create shots for teammates, a good passer, post game is really solid. Now, I said that we weren't going to call anyone a bust for the remainder of the video, but I lied to you boys. This guy Jerome has to be on the Mount Rushmore of shitty NBA players. Jerome never played over 50 games for a team, nobody who had him wanted him, and he struggled to hit 40% from the field as a power forward who was just scoring inside for the most part. I mean, the whole high potential, good passer, good post-game thing was a load of BS. This guy was completely bagless. He could jump, I guess, and would grab like 4 boards in limited minutes after missing like 6 shots in a row, and not having the defensive IQ to contest shots without fouling people's heads off. I mean, the Celtics fans have witnessed some good teams, but during the dark period between Larry Bird and the Big Three Celtics, having to watch Jerome Moiso suit up may have been the darkest of all the days. Now, for picks 12 to 14 to wrap up the lottery, we got Etan Thomas to the Wizards, a relatively average big man who scored 6 points per game before a heart condition greatly shortened his NBA career. Courtney Alexander would be a decent scorer for a year or two, but would then blow up his Achilles tendon. After frequently saying how good his Achilles felt in interviews, Alexander would go out there and build houses as we watched his short career burn to the ground. And Mateen Cleaves Cleaves, who is an ass-cheeks point guard, scoring 3.6 points per game and shooting 38% from the field. Good shit, Cleaves. And just like that, we've officially finished up the lottery. I mean, this was pretty ridiculous, dude. Out of every player we just spent 16 minutes covering, Kenyon Martin's 2004 campaign was the only all-star season any of these guys put together. Now, in terms of lotteries, this has got to be the worst ever. I mean, out of all these guys, Jamal Crawford probably had the best career, and even at that was never an all-star. To put this into comparison with other draft lotteries, the 1988 class was relatively weak up front, with Danny Manning, the first pick, not lighting the world on fire, but after that, there's too many solid guys to compete. With Mitch Richmond, a Hall of Famer, Hershey Hawkins, who was really solid for a time, Rick Smits, who was probably better than Kenyon Martin, and Dan Marley, who'd easily be a top 2 or 3 player in the 2000s lottery. 2002 was a major miss as well, with guys like Jay Williams and DeWan Wagner both unfortunately not elevating the class to what it could have been, but with Amari Stoudemire and more importantly Yao Ming, that alone elevates them well beyond it. 2006 gave us some disappointments like Andrea Bargnani, who's a bit worse than Kenyon Martin I'd say, Sheldon Williams, Adam Morrison, and a bunch of other busts, but with Brandon Roy's brief but excellent run, and LaMarcus Aldridge's solid career, as well as JJ Redick even putting up a good resume, I don't think this one can quite top it either. Honestly, 2013 comes pretty damn close. Anthony Bennett #1 was a massive flop. The only all-star level players were CJ McCollum and Victor Oladipo, both of who were only in the limelight for a brief while, and the only valuable pieces outside of that were Otto Porter, KCP, and Steven Adams. In terms of just valuable pieces, the 2013 class might slightly beat out 2000, but Giannis being drafted just 1 pick out of the lottery completely blows this out of the water. But in fairness, in terms of the 2000 draft, I think the actual best player is still yet to come. Outside of the lottery is where the 2000 class actually starts to heat up quite a bit. Jason Collier at 15 didn't do jack shit, but Hedo Turkoglu at 16 was definitely a well above average NBA player. He was a super late bloomer, which is a bit unusual, winning the most improved player award in his age 28 season, putting up 19, 6, and 5 on 45, 40, and 83 shooting splits. As a 6'10 small forward, he's mostly remembered for being a giant lights out shooter playing on the perimeter while Dwight Howard went nuclear on the interior. But his game was weirdly super versatile. I mean, this guy wasn't necessarily getting plays written up for him, but when nothing else was working, Hedo was a great creator for his size, either for himself or for his teammates. He could handle the ball pretty well, made big shot after big shot in the playoffs, and really was a crucial piece to those Magic teams that would have never made a finals run without him. Really, while Jameer Nelson and Rashard Lewis made an all-star team next to him, Hedo probably deserved a nod as well, although he never got one. Unfortunately, after his run with the Magic, he got a huge payday from the Raptors, in which Hedo kinda got fat and further cut his prime short, which was already short due to his late bloom. I guess I'll also note that this guy got booked for doing steroids, which kinda threw off his momentum a bit. I mean, as like a shifty ball-handling shooter guy, getting jacked didn't really help him make more jumpers. I don't really know why this guy had to hop on juice in the middle of his prime, but whatever, I guess. All in all, Hedo was a problem for legitimate teams to contain when in his prime. As a guy who could go off for 30 without needing plays written for him, he was a very talented player to go this late in the draft, and definitely is one of the best players we've covered thus far. Immediately following Hedo was another guy that for his draft position did likely outperform expectations. Desmond Mason didn't light the world on fire statistically, but on ESPN, this guy was catching bodies left and right. At the basket, this guy was fire, scoring efficiently and getting to the line where he shot league average, but outside of like 3 feet, this guy's efficiency would immediately fall to 35%. He was a total brick. I mean, he wasn't ridiculous or anything. At his best, he was putting up 17 a game on bad efficiency on bad teams, but when he was paired up with good point guards like CP or Gary Payton, he did kind of make it work, scoring over 13 a game on competitive teams. I mean, for most drafts, Mason's kind of just another guy, but for the 2000 draft, to be putting up over 15 a game at any point in your career is definitely worth a mention. Alongside his fellow knucklehead in the 2000 draft was Quentin Richardson. Q-Rich was pretty good for going 18th. Like I said, the draft certainly did pick up some steam. Richardson, alongside Miles and Lamar Odom in their early days on the Clippers, actually made for some super fun basketball. Richardson was a shit defender, but other than that, this guy was pretty good all around. Richardson was a big physical guard that played in the post super well for his position, clashed the glass super well for a 2-guard as well, and made a living as a 3-point shooter playing 13 years in the NBA. I mean, this guy was more so kind of well-liked than effective. He put up 17 a game on the Clippers, and they were a ton of fun to watch, but did so on sub 40% shooting, so that kind of tells you all you gotta know. Q-Rich was a bit up and down throughout his career. More so a solid spark off the bench than a reliable piece for most of his career, but at 18th overall, certainly above average. Now at 19th overall, we finally got the second All-Star of this draft class, and it's probably the worst All-Star in history in Jamal Magloire. For one season, this guy averaged a 13-10 double-double, and for some some odd reason, that was enough to be selected. This guy's really kind of shit, to be honest, only scoring 12 once in his 12-year career, most of which he was scoring under 2 points per game. Honestly, if he didn't make the All-Star team, we probably wouldn't even be talking about Jamal. I really could care less about this guy. I, like most of you, love fucking talking about weird niche players from my childhood, and I still had no idea who the fuck this guy was until I made that worst All-Stars video with AI Jeff Teague in the thumbnail. I mean, with 7 points per game for his career, he may have made the second All-Star selection of the class, but really this is not helping their cause at all. We've covered some horseshit players thus far, and a decent amount of these guys were better than Jamal. Now honestly, in terms of memorable careers, that just about does it. Speedy Claxton hit some shots for the Spurs in their championship run, Morris Peterson was a double-digit scorer on some pretty shitty Raptors squads, and Deshaun Stevenson was a pest that fought LeBron and won a ring on the Mavericks. But he also did some pretty nasty stuff, so he doesn't really deserve any credit. From about 20 onwards, you might not recognize a single fucking name, except for one guy drafted 43rd overall to the Milwaukee Bucks. Michael Redd, in my opinion, was the best player in the 2000 draft class. Drafted as just kind of a random selection to back up Ray Allen on the Bucks, this guy busted his ass hard enough to where the Bucks were completely fine trading away Allen and doubling down on Redd. And really, it's hard to say he underperformed even in comparison to Ray Allen. This guy was super loyal to Milwaukee. Even though the team was total dog water, Michael Redd re-signed with the Bucks, even with a Cleveland LeBron James begging him to come play with him. Really, I wish he wouldn't have stayed in Milwaukee for multiple reasons. One, of course, this guy just carried a terrible Bucks squad, putting up 20 a game for 6 years straight and peaking at 27 a game in 2007. Redd was the third All-Star selection of the draft and the only one out of all 58 picks to be selected for an All-NBA team, getting selected in 2004. I mean, seeing this guy next to LeBron would have been nuts. Redd was a sick 3-point shooter who would hunt space super well. I see a lot of comparisons to a prime Chris Middleton now, and not only because of the team, but it isn't a bad comparison. Offensively, Redd was a bit better of a shot creator than Middleton all in all. He was one of the only 2 guards to kill you from deep back in the day in the way that he did, and having a point forward like LeBron by his side would have made those Cleveland teams so much more fun, and would have made his career so much more relevant to anyone other than Milwaukee fans. Unfortunately, despite having the highest peak of anyone drafted in the 2000 draft, Redd was asked to carry too much, as tearing his ACL twice would completely derail his career in his late 20s. And as far as talent goes, that's about it. The 2000 draft had 3 All-Stars. Not just 3 All-Star players, but 3 All-Star selections total. 2 of them being pretty questionable as players who were really never too All-Star caliber. I mean, this is shit. The NBA averages about 6 All-Star players per draft class, with the last time the NBA producing this little being in 1952. And like I said, even at that, the quality of the All-Star talent other than Michael Redd was pretty poor. This could and maybe should have been the only All-Star selection out of the entire talent pool. I mean, in terms of talent, the class was pitifully low in any way you look at it. Redd and Jamal Crawford were the only players to ever average over 20 points per game for a season, while Jamal Crawford did it only once. Kenyon Martin was by far the best rebounder in the class, averaging only 6.8 per game, which is kind of below average at his position. And Jamal Crawford is the leader in assists by a country mile, while being thought of as a total ball hog in the NBA. Even in terms of just role players, the class didn't produce whatsoever. In fact, the 2000 draft class was the only draft that produced an average number of wins below replacement level. So from the day these guys came in to the day they left, the league literally would have been better off saying, nah, we're good, and not giving any of these guys an opportunity to play in the NBA. I set out here today to maybe shine some light on some forgotten pieces of this draft. I knew the perception of this class was the worst of all time, but I figured there had to be a light at the tunnel. In reality, the 2000 draft class was not only the worst in history, but frankly, I don't think there's a modern draft that's in the same ballpark as this one. No generational talent, almost no star level talent, and a group of guys that as a collective brought down the talent level of the entire league. Maybe this 2024 class will show up these guys, but really, it looks like they got their work cut out for them. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. We're trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and as always, I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.